Hi, welcome back to the workshop for episode 48 of the ES335 build. And while I've got the body hung up out of the way, drying, ready for its polishing, I'm going to tackle a few of the little jobs that still need doing. And in this episode, it's what is the bane of many people's lives when they're building a guitar, and that is doing the wiring. So to get started on this wiring, I'll just run you through the components that I've got. So I've got 4 CTS pots. These are 500Ks, which is what I like to use with humbuckers. I've got a Switchcraft toggle switch. I'm trying to use some really nice quality components for this build. I've got a Switchcraft output jack, and this is one of the ones with a slightly longer threaded collar on them, just to get it through the top of the guitar. And I've got 2 orange drop caps. These are 0.47 microfarad. A lot of people like 0.22. I actually prefer these because it gives you the option to roll off a little bit more treble. Having said that, I very rarely utilise my tone controls a huge amount, but it's always there if you need it. I've got some hookup wire. I've got some 4-core cable, which I'm going to use for quite a bit of this wiring, just to keep it all nice and neat. The problem with the 335 is you can see through the F-holes, and if you've got lots of wires running about, you can sometimes see them, which I think is unacceptable. Bit of heat shrink, again, just to try and keep things nice and tidy in there. And then the Tone Rider pickups, but we won't be needing these just yet. I won't do the final wiring on these until we're actually putting the guitar together. And I've also got some wiring diagrams. So I've got one from the Seymour Duncan website. I've used these a lot in the past and they've always worked out really well. So a trusted source, and there's a wiring diagram from the pickup packaging. Having had a very quick look at these, they both show exactly the same thing, they just present it slightly differently. But it's always good to have a kind of double check to make sure you're on the right track. But while we're doing this, we also need to make sure that it's all going to fit once we start putting it together, and that we're allowing enough wire for things to reach where they need to reach once it's all assembled. Obviously we don't have the luxury of doing it from the back, so if we don't put enough wire between things, it's never going to work. So we're going to need some kind of a template. Now, if you can remember back all the way to episode 1 of this series, which I admit is a very, very long time ago now, but we made a template for the body shape. And while I was making that, I actually marked on the locations for all the controls. Now, I've drilled those out, so we now have an absolutely spot on template for how we need to do our wiring. So I'm just going to set that up on some bench cookies to get it off the bench a little bit, just to give the controls a little bit of room to poke through. So we can now position all of our controls exactly where we need them. And by doing that, ensure that we've got ample wire to make sure that this all fits in properly. Right. So let's break out the soldering iron and start working our way through this. So the first thing I'm going to do in wiring this up is to get the switch wired up. Now, I was thinking about using some 4-strand multi-core to do this, but having looked at it, it's not really going to give me any benefit, so I'll just wire it up with some of this kind of standard wiring. And the first thing I'm going to do is use my new Posh wire holding jig thing. And tin up this wire. And while I'm busy doing this, why don't you take the opportunity to hit the like and subscribe buttons? It really would help me out. And then just attach that to the output lug of the switch. Now this wire will eventually go to the output jack, but I'm not going to attach that just yet. And then I'll just attach that little bit of wire from the switch there. And then that will go to the centre lug of the bridge pickup volume pot. And with that done, I just need to repeat the same trick on the other lug of the switch. And wire that into the same lug, centre lug, on the neck pickup volume pot. And the final step for the switch is just to run a ground out of it, and I'll attach that to one of the pots. So with all the wires attached to the switch now, I'll bring you in a little bit closer and I'll just show you what connections we need to do on the volume pots. So the first thing I need to do with both these volume pots is to just solder this third lug to the case. So I had some questions after the last couple of episodes about the spray gun that I use, but before I go through exactly what it is, I just want to talk about my rationale in choosing that particular spray gun. Now, up until about a year ago, I was just using a normal gravity-fed spray gun, but in the small enclosed area that I use it in without any extraction, overspray was a massive issue. And whenever I sprayed anything, the huge amount of overspray in the room just got sucked back onto the wet lacquer, and it just meant that I had to flat everything down between coats, and it made things really difficult. So I decided to look into getting a HVLP gun just to see if that would reduce the overspray some. But I wasn't entirely sure that that was going to work, so I didn't want to fork out a load of money for a gun that might not suit my purposes. And this is what I got. And this is actually one of the cheapest guns that you can get off Amazon. However, this has been absolutely brilliant. I couldn't be more pleased with it. Now, I'm not saying it's the best gun you're going to get, but when you bear in mind the conditions I'm working in, this is more than adequate. The problem I have in the shed with no extraction is that overspray gets everywhere and it gets onto the job. And once that overspray settles onto the wet lacquer, it kind of ruins any chance you have of having a really, really nice gun finish. So until I get decent extraction sorted out in here, this is as good as I need. I can't get any better results regardless of how good my gun is. And I'd go as far as to say that for 90% of the people out there who want to just finish the odd guitar, this is a good enough gun. I'm going to leave a link in the description for it. I can't remember off the top of my head, I'd have to check, but it was certainly no more than £15. I've sprayed 4 guitars with it now. I've got a really good feel for the gun and it's done a great job on all of them. So yeah, so I would definitely recommend this as a good entry-level HVLP gun. But there are a few caveats with that. You need to make sure that what's going into the gun is clean. Otherwise you're not going to have good results. So while you're buying the gun, buy yourself a pack of paint filters. I bought 100 of these for a couple of quid. And also the little inline filter that goes into the gun underneath the paint cup. Again, I bought 40 for a couple of quid. I do 3 or 4 guitars a year. They're going to last me for a very long time. Okay, so with these lugs attached, now what I need to start doing is getting some ground wires onto these pots. Now essentially we need all of these components grounded, and we also need an additional ground wire that will run to the bridge stud. So I'm just going to prepare a few bits of wire to do that with. And then I need to get a good blob of solder onto this volume pot. And then just need to add a little bit to the bridge pickup volume pot. Okay, so that's the wiring we can do for the time being onto the two volume pots. Theoretically, I could attach the wires from the bridge pickup onto the volume pot now, because I can feed all of this in through the bridge pickup route. However, I do need to do some setup work on the rest of the guitar yet, and I need the bridge pickup to do that, so I don't want it wired to this loom because that would just make things complicated. So the next step is to start wiring the tone controls into the circuit, and the first stage of that is to put a link between each of the volume and tone pots. So I'll just prep up a couple of little bits of wire. And just pre-tin the lugs on the pots. And then we just simply just solder them all into position. And just trimming stuff off so it's nice and neat. Now you might notice I'm leaving quite a lot of spare wire between these connections, and that's just to make this loom easier to pull into position when I'm doing that, but also you don't want any tension on these wires in these semi-hollow builds because it just causes stress and weakness and eventually failure, and it's just a load of work to pull them out and redo it. So this is just kind of a safety measure really. It also means that once I install these pots, I can twist them into an appropriate position and it will kind of pull the wiring out of the view of the F-hole. So that's another reason for doing that. Okay, so before I attach the rest of the ground wires, I want to get the capacitors in. Now, I've got two different drawings and they show two different things, both of which would work absolutely fine, but only one of which I'm going to use. Now, on one drawing, it shows the capacitor to be positioned between the central lug of the tone pot and the hot lug of the volume pot. Now the problem with that is it leaves this capacitor connected between the two pots, so all the messing about you're going to do to get these pots in, all the movement that involves is going to be jiggling this and putting stress on the joint, so that's not really an ideal situation for me. The other way of doing it is to just attach it to the middle lug there and then ground it onto the pot body, and that does exactly the same thing, but it makes it a much stronger connection, and that's the way we're going to go with that. So the first job again is just to get a nice big dab of solder onto the case of the pot like that, and tin the lug. And then we can just solder that into place. And then trim off the excess. Now in some situations, having the capacitors on the top of the pots like that can be a bit of an issue if you're kind of tight for clearance in the body, but in this body there's plenty of room, so that's not going to be an issue. Okay, with the capacitors in, now all we need to do is just get these ground wires joined in as well. And now all that leaves me to do is to wire in the output jack. Now normally if I was doing this I'd run the ground wire from the nearest pot, because I want to kind of try and keep these wires as neat as possible. And looking at the wiring at the moment, that's not very neat at all, but there are issues with this build which kind of mean we'll only ever be so neat with it. So to that end I'm actually going to ground it to this volume pot, simply because it runs nearest to where the output from the switch is going to run. And that actually means that I can run those two wires through a little bit of heat shrink, and that will keep them nice and tidy. And then we can attach these in the normal way. Okay, and that's basically the wiring done, but this still looks a little bit too scruffy for me, and I acknowledge that this is never going to really be seen because it's going to be inside the guitar, but I still want it to look a little bit nicer than this, and also hopefully this will help keep it a little bit more robust when we're pulling it into the body. So what I'm going to do is just use some little cable ties just to hold stuff together. And just make it look a bit prettier. And then finally I'll just hit this with a heat gun and shrink the tubing down a bit. And there we have the almost completed wiring harness. The only thing we need to do now is attach the wires from the pickups to the appropriate pots at the correct time, but obviously that isn't now. But there is one last little job that I need to do before this is all ready to go. And to do that I need to take it out of its little holder and turn them all over, because we need to put one of these star washers onto each of the pots. Otherwise there's a chance that they might start spinning in the body. And if they start spinning in the body, it's going to introduce stress onto the wiring joints, and we really don't want that. However, in this situation, if we try and pull these in with these washers loose on the pot shafts, they're going to fall off in the body, and we're just going to spend hours and hours messing around with it. So we need to find a way of sticking these into position so they don't move when we assemble the guitar. And what I'm going to use to stop them moving is just a drop of clear nail varnish. And all you do is just stick a little bit on each of them. And once that dries, it'll just hold them nicely in position until you can get a knot onto them. And that, for the time being at least, is the wiring sorted. So that can be put in a safe place now until we need it, and we can get on with a few of the other little jobs. I hope you found that useful. I know I said at the beginning that some people really struggle with wiring, so hopefully there's a few tips in there that will help you in future projects. If so, don't forget to hit that like and subscribe if you haven't already done so, and I'll see you on the next episode. Thanks a lot for watching. Bye bye.